Hi, this is Rick with Rage Against Debt. In this video, we'll look at the political silver bullet for our national debt, higher economic growth. It's every politician's dream solution for our debt crisis. And it seems every year there are optimistic forecasts that will get the U.S. deficits and the debt back under control in the long term. So let's take a look at why so many of our politicians and political pundits push economic growth as the solution to our debt crisis. Welcome back to the revolution. This graph shows an example of typical GDP or economic growth and shows roughly a 3% annual growth rate. As GDP grows, government revenue or taxes grow as well. The government takes a percent of the economy or GDP in the form of taxes, so the amount of revenue the government receives grows at roughly the same rate as GDP. If we could alter the rate of growth to say a 5% growth rate, then we would also increase the amount of revenue or taxes that the government receives. That would mean hundreds of billions of dollars more each year and would add up to trillions of extra dollars for the government in a few years. It's a great scenario for politicians, allowing them to fund all the current budgets, programs, and entitlements without having to cut anything that might upset the voters that put them in office. This chart shows actual growth in GDP, adjusted for inflation, from 1950 to 2001. The GDP is shown on the left of the chart. In 2001, the U.S. real GDP was approximately $13 trillion, and the growth rate was averaging about 3.3% per year during the latter half of this period. Federal government revenue was growing at about the same rate and was just under $2.5 trillion in 2001. Now, what if we could use a time machine and travel back to 1977, where we alter the economic fortunes of the U.S. and set GDP on a 4.5% growth rate? GDP would have grown to almost $17 trillion by 2001. The increased economic growth would have meant greater revenue or taxes for the U.S. government. Federal revenue in 2001 would be over $3 trillion. That's over $500 billion more than it actually was in just 2001 alone. Over the entire period from 1977 to 2001, the federal government would have received about $8 trillion more in revenues. You might now be wondering, how much was the total national debt in 2001, and how does that compare to the extra revenue that the federal government would have received? Well, the national debt was $5.8 trillion in 2001. In theory, a 4.5% growth rate in GDP would have paid off our national debt. There is one catch besides the fact that we don't have a time machine, and that catch is that the government must still spend less than it receives in order to avoid having deficits. If we look at the expenditures versus the government revenue for this same time period, we see that the federal government spent more than it received for the majority of those years. That creates budget deficits for the federal government, and deficits add up to the national debt. So even if we grow the economy faster, if the government spends more because it has more, then we will still incur deficits and the federal debt will only continue to grow. So no matter the growth rate, the key is to actually manage the expenditures so that government revenue is never less than government expenditures. Both sides of the equation need to be managed effectively, revenues and expenditures.
Let me ask a more general economic question. A lot of people have been talking about 4% GDP growth. Is that realistic in a mature economy? A developing economy can have those very high growth rates, and 4% was what we had, but do you see any combination of policies that would get us to 4% GDP growth?
Well, if we're talking about the short term, just basic stimulus, we could accelerate the elimination of the output gap over the next 2 years. We could accelerate that. But for having anything lasting, we need to worry about the supply side of things. To give you some idea of how...
When you say the supply side of things, you're not talking about supply side Arthur Laffer. You're talking about the supply side of, like, labor force and productivity.
That's right. Labor force, the capital stock, innovation, those sorts of things.
Right.
But I wanted to couch this a little bit. And right now, over the next 10 years, we're seeing the labor force grow at about a 0.5 percentage point a year. And we're seeing labor force productivity grow at about 1.3% a year. That adds up to about 1.8% GDP. That is our forecast for potential GDP. So if you want to get potential GDP up, you've got to raise
one of those two items.
One of those two things or both. That's right.
By 2027, discretionary spending will be at the lowest level as a percentage of GDP that it's been since 1962. Despite this, both deficits and the overall debt are expected to increase dramatically. Is it correct then to say that Congress's current approach to reducing the deficit, that is only reducing discretionary spending, is sustainable in the long term?
That will be very difficult, and I can give you a good example. Right now, in 10 years, we forecast that the deficit is going to be about $1.4 trillion. Total discretionary spending in 10 years would be about $1.5 trillion. So it's essentially, if you did it all with discretionary spending, both defense and non-defense, you'd wipe out all the discretionary spending to balance the budget.
Please join us for the next episodes of Rage Against the Debt, where we'll discuss why relying solely on economic growth to solve our debt crisis won't work. We'll look at the historical relationship of GDP and debt, as well as an example of a recent period when forecasts suggested the debt issue would be resolved and what actually occurred. Until then, viva la revolution.